Dan Carter watched 20 different aliens prepare for death. Some flexed natural armor, others tested claws against metal walls. A few regulated body temperature, glowing faintly with internal heat. Dan just sat quietly, running through mental checklists his grandfather taught him during camping trips in the Rockies. The Varan coordinator, an insect-like being with 4 arms and compound eyes, addressed the contestants through translation devices embedded in their suits. Welcome to the survival trials. You represent the finest physical specimens from your worlds. The challenge is simple. Survive on Caldris 7 for as long as possible. The rules are equally simple. No advanced technology, no manufactured tools, no energy weapons or devices, only what your biology provides. A massive Krellite built like a walking tank with thick armored plates laughed. This will be easy. My kind evolved on a world with predators twice my size. A Velpari resembling a large bat with intelligent eyes clicked softly. My echolocation can map terrain in complete darkness. I will thrive. The Varan turned compound eyes toward Dan. Human, your species file indicates average strength, average speed, and limited sensory capabilities. Most human contestants request withdrawal before deployment. Are you certain you wish to continue? Dan stood up slowly. He was not impressive next to these aliens. Average height, normal build, no visible weapons or armor. I have a question. Proceed. Can I bring knowledge? The Varan tilted its head, confused. Knowledge is not physical. The restriction is on tools and technology. Just checking, Dan said, sitting back down. Several aliens chittered with what the translator marked as laughter. A Therman, glowing with internal heat, spoke up. The human asks about bringing thoughts. Perhaps Earth produces philosophers, not survivors. The Varan made notes on a holographic display. Prediction models suggest the human will signal for extraction within 30 hours. Possibly sooner. The coordinator paused, looking at Dan with what might have been pity. There is no shame in recognizing biological limitations. Dan smiled but said nothing. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Son, humans aren't the biggest or fastest. We're the ones who figured out how to turn everything else into tools. The drop pods launched an hour later. Dan strapped into his pod alone, watching through the small viewport as the moon of Caldris 7 grew larger. The surface looked harsh. Rocky terrain cut through with deep canyons, patches of ice near the poles, dark areas that might be volcanic, scattered vegetation in green and purple colors Earth biology never produced. The pod shook violently during entry. Heat shields glowed red. Then the parachutes deployed and the descent slowed. Dan watched the ground carefully, noting landmarks, water sources, potential shelter locations. The pod crashed into a rocky canyon with a bone-jarring impact. The door blew open with explosive bolts. Hot air rushed in, carrying strange scents. Dan unstrapped and stepped out carefully, immediately assessing his situation. Canyon walls rose 30 meters on both sides. The sun, actually the gas giant this moon orbited, hung huge and red in the sky. Gravity felt close to Earth normal. Temperature was hot but manageable. Dan knelt and touched the soil. Dry, rocky, but with organic matter mixed in. He spotted something and smiled. Flint. Lots of it scattered among the rocks. Through his translation device, he heard other contestants making first moves. The Krellite was already hunting, crashing through brush after some local prey animal. The Velpari found a cave and was claiming it with ultrasonic marking. The Therman headed straight for the volcanic region visible in the distance. Dan ignored them all. He walked slowly along the canyon floor, eyes on the ground. Not looking for food or shelter yet, looking for rocks. He found what he needed within an hour. Flint, quartzite, and a nice piece of chert. He gathered them carefully, testing their quality by how they fractured when he tapped them together. Good. Very good. In the observation station orbiting Caldris 7, dozens of alien scientists watched through camera drones. The Varan coordinator monitored all 20 contestants simultaneously, tracking vital signs and behavior patterns. The Krellite has made first kill, one observer reported. Impressive speed despite armor. The Velpari established secure shelter, another added. Excellent defensive position. The Therman reached the volcanic zone, body temperature stabilizing in optimal range. The coordinator nodded at each report, making notes. Then it noticed something odd. What is the human doing? On the screen, Dan sat cross-legged on the ground, surrounded by rocks. He was picking them up, looking at them closely, setting some aside, keeping others. Unknown behavior, an observer said. Possibly stress response? Some species engage in repetitive tasks when frightened. Vital signs show no stress, the coordinator noted. Heart rate normal. Breathing steady. He appears calm. Perhaps humans collect rocks for comfort? Another observer suggested. Emotional support items? The coordinator updated its notes. Human behavior unusual but non-threatening. Prediction extraction request within 24 hours. Dan worked until the sunset. He found a small overhang that provided some shelter from wind and potential rain. He gathered dry grass and small twigs, making a nest of material. Then he selected 2 rocks carefully. One was flint, the other a piece of iron-rich stone. Dan struck them together at the correct angle, aiming the sparks at the dry grass. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. Third try. A spark caught. The grass smoldered. Dan bent close and blew gently, feeding oxygen to the ember. The grass burst into tiny flames. Dan carefully added twigs, building the fire larger. Within minutes, he had a real fire burning. The observation station exploded with activity. Exothermic chemical reaction detected in human's location. Is it a volcanic event? Negative. Source is organic combustion. He created fire. The coordinator's compound eyes focused on the screen. Dan sat calmly, feeding his fire with sticks, the flames reflecting in his eyes. How did he generate ignition? The observers reviewed the footage. He struck 2 stones together. The impact created sparks. The sparks ignited dried plant material. Silence filled the observation deck. Finally, a young Varan researcher spoke quietly. He did not create fire. He created the conditions for fire to exist. Using only materials present in the environment. The coordinator stared at the screen. Dan had laid out his collected rocks in an organized pattern. The purpose was unclear, but the intent was obvious. The human had a plan. Update prediction model, the coordinator said slowly. The human may last longer than anticipated. As the first night descended on Keldra 7, 3 contestants had already signaled for extraction. The cold was too intense, or the predators too aggressive, or the isolation too frightening. But in a small canyon, a human sat by a fire, warm and safe, slowly striking rocks together to shape them into tools his ancestors would recognize. Dan held up a sharp flake of flint, testing the edge with his thumb. It would cut. It would skin game. It would shape wood. No tools allowed, he muttered, smiling. Good thing rocks aren't tools until someone makes them tools. He fed another stick to the fire and settled in for the night, already planning tomorrow's work. Shelter improvement, water procurement, hunting preparations. His grandfather would be proud. Above, in the observation station, the young Varan researcher whispered to a colleague. I think we made a mistake. What mistake? We assume tools are things you bring. But what if tools are things you make? What if the human brought the most dangerous thing of all? What is that? The researcher pointed at the screen where Dan was arranging stones with clear purpose. Knowledge of how everything can become a tool. Dan woke to the sound of something screaming in the distance. Not a human scream. Something alien and terrified. Then silence. Another contestant was either dead or had triggered their emergency extraction. He counted in his head. That made 5 gone already. 15 remained. He stretched carefully, checking for injuries or stiffness. The fire had burned down to coals overnight, but he had banked it properly before sleeping. A technique humans learned thousands of years ago. Cover the coals with ash, restrict oxygen, let them smolder. In the morning, add kindling and blow gently. The fire returned to life. Dan sat by the growing flames and examined his hands. Blisters were forming from yesterday's rock work. He ignored them. Pain was just information. The blisters would harden into calluses. His body would adapt. Around him, scattered in organized piles, were the results of yesterday's labor. Sharp flakes of flint that could cut through hide and meat. A hand-sized rock with one end shaped into a chopping edge. Several long, straight sticks he had collected and stripped of bark. And most importantly, a pile of plant fibers he had identified as suitable for cordage. The observation station was already watching. It always watched. The human maintained fire through the night, an observer reported. No other contestant has achieved sustained combustion control. The Varan coordinator studied the data. The Krellite is suffering from temperature loss. Their armor provides protection but no insulation. The Vilpari is stable but unable to hunt effectively. Most contestants are in defensive positions, conserving energy. The human appears to be constructing something, another observer noted. On the screen, Dan had started his morning work. He took the plant fibers and began twisting them together. His fingers moved in a pattern humans had used since the Stone Age. Over, under, twist, pull tight. The individual weak fibers became strong cordage. What is he making? The coordinator asked. Unknown. The fibers are being combined, but the purpose is unclear. Dan worked for 2 hours, creating several meters of rough rope. It was not pretty, but it was strong. He tested it by trying to break it with his hands. It held. Good enough. Next, he selected his best stone tools. The sharpest flake became a knife. He used the cordage to lash it to a wooden handle, wrapping it tightly and tying it with knots that would not slip. The result was crude but functional. A knife. A real tool. He made a second tool by attaching a stone point to a long straight branch. A spear. Basic but effective. The observers were silent watching this transformation. Raw materials becoming tools. Tools becoming survival capability. The human is creating weaponry, the coordinator said finally. But from what? He brought nothing with him. The young Varan researcher answered quietly. He brought everything. He brought the knowledge of how to see weapons in rocks and rope in plants. That knowledge is more dangerous than any tool. Dan stood and stretched. Time to find water. He had seen moisture indicators yesterday, plants that only grew near water sources. He followed them, moving carefully through the canyon. His spear stayed ready. He had spotted predator tracks earlier. 6-legged prints, deep claws, something big. The water source was a small stream flowing between rocks. Dan did not drink immediately. Instead, he observed. The water was clear. Small aquatic creatures swam in it, which meant it was not toxic. But clear water could still carry parasites or bacteria dangerous to humans. He returned to his camp and selected several round stones. He placed them directly in the fire, letting them heat until they were almost glowing. Then, using 2 sticks, he carefully moved them to a shallow depression he had dug near the stream. He lined the depression with broad leaves and filled it with water. The hot stones hit the water with a hiss. Steam rose. The water began to boil. In the observation station, a xenobiologist stood abruptly. He is purifying water through thermal processing, without any container technology. Explain, the coordinator demanded. He heated stones, then transferred thermal energy to water. The elevated temperature kills potential pathogens. He created a sterile drinking supply using only natural materials. The coordinator's compound eyes focused intently on the screen. How did he know to do this? His species must have developed this technique through trial and error over many generations. This is not instinct. This is learned, taught, and remembered knowledge. Dan drank the boiled water once it cooled slightly. It tasted of minerals and stone, but it was safe. He made several trips purifying enough water to last the day. Next task, food. He had spotted small animals yesterday, rabbit-sized creatures with 6 legs that moved in quick, erratic patterns. He called them skits in his head. Fast, nervous, but not intelligent enough to recognize new dangers. Dan did not try to chase them. Humans were not built for speed. Instead, he studied their trails. The skits had worn paths through the grass, routes they used repeatedly. Habit and instinct made them predictable. He created snares using his cordage, simple loops attached to bent branches. When a skit ran through the loop, its movement would trigger the branch to snap upward, tightening the noose. The same trap humans had used for thousands of years. Dan set 5 snares along different trails, then returned to camp. Patience was a tool, too. While waiting, he worked on improving his shelter. The overhang was good, but not good enough. He gathered more stones and began stacking them to create walls on the exposed sides. Dry grass and leaves went between stones for insulation. He was building something between a lean-to and a proper structure. Hours passed. Dan checked his snares. 3 were empty. 2 had caught skits. He killed them quickly with respect, then carried them back to camp. He had never cleaned game before in his life, but he had watched videos, read survival guides, listened to his grandfather's stories. The knowledge was there, stored in his memory. He just had to access it. The stone knife worked well. He made the initial cuts carefully, separating hide from meat. The organs he buried far from camp to avoid attracting predators. The meat he cut into strips. Some he would eat today. The rest he would smoke over the fire to preserve it. By evening, Dan had accomplished what many contestants had not. Sustained fire, clean water, food, shelter, basic tools. The fundamentals of survival. But something else was happening across Keldra 7. Other contestants were suffering. The Krellite, despite natural armor, was shivering uncontrollably. Armor provided protection but trapped cold. The alien had no way to generate heat. The Velpari named Trill was struggling too. Echolocation was useless for finding food. The prey was too small and fast. Hunger was setting in. Through the translation network, a message reached Dan's location.
Human Dan, this is Trill of the Velpari.
I am in distress. My shelter is secure, but I have no food. I have no heat. I do not wish to signal extraction, but I may not survive the night. Dan considered the message. Trill was a competitor. Helping meant reducing his own advantages. But something in him, something deeply human, could not ignore a call for help. Trill, can you locate my position? Yes, 2 kilometers from your location. Can you travel at night? I travel better at night than day. My echolocation is optimized for darkness. Dan made a decision. Come to my camp. Look for the fire. I will share my shelter. Silence on the network. Then Trill's voice, confused. Why would you help a competitor?
Dan fed another stick to his fire.
Because you asked. And because where I come from, we do not leave people to freeze when we have fire to share. The observation station erupted in discussion. Helping a competitor violated the basic logic of survival trials. Individual performance was being measured. By sharing resources, Dan was reducing his own survival probability. The coordinator turned to the young researcher. Explain this behavior. The researcher thought carefully. Perhaps humans evolved in conditions where cooperation provided greater survival advantages than competition. Perhaps on Earth working together was the only way to survive. That seems inefficient, the coordinator said. Does it? The researcher pointed at the screen where Dan was preparing a second sleeping area near the fire. He is about to have an ally with superior sensory capabilities. He trades food and warmth for night vision and threat detection. That seems very efficient to me. Trill arrived an hour later, guided by the fire's glow. The Velpari was shivering despite their fur-like covering. Dan immediately brought the alien close to the flames and offered smoked meat. This is cooked food, Trill said, amazed. I have eaten only raw prey since arriving. This is easier to digest. Fire does more than provide heat, Dan explained. It transforms food, purifies water, hardens wood, shapes tools. Fire is humanity's first and most important technology. Trill ate gratefully. How did you create fire? My people have legends of it from our primitive past, but the knowledge was lost when we developed industrial technology. Dan held up the flint and striker. Friction and sparks. The same way your ancestors probably did it. The same way every species probably discovered it the first time. But you remembered, Trill said softly. Your people kept the knowledge alive. We had to, Dan replied. Earth taught us that civilization is fragile. The knowledge of how to survive without technology is the foundation everything else builds on. Forget that foundation and everything collapses. They sat by the fire as the second night descended. 2 species, 2 different evolutionary paths, 1 fire. In the observation station, the coordinator updated its report. Human behavior continues to defy prediction models. However, survival capability assessment must be revised upward, significantly upward. The young researcher watched Dan teach Trill how to maintain the fire through the night. I do not think we are measuring survival anymore. I think we are witnessing something else. What? The birth of civilization. This is how it starts. Fire tools cooperation. We are watching the process that turned primitives into starfarers, and the human is showing us it can happen anywhere with anyone, as long as someone remembers how. Dawn broke with Trill's scream of warning. Dan was awake instantly, grabbing his spear. The Velpari's echolocation had detected something approaching. Something big. Distance? Dan asked, already moving to a defensive position. 60 meters and closing. Mass approximately 5 times your body weight. 6-legged locomotion. Predator classification certain. Dan had known this moment would come. He had seen the tracks. The territorial markings. Caldrus 7 had apex predators, and his camp with its fire and food had drawn attention. The creature emerged from the canyon shadows. It stood over 2 meters tall at the shoulder, built like a nightmare fusion of bear and lizard. 6 powerful legs ending in claws that scored rock. Armored plating covered its back and head. Thermal pits along its snout, which meant it hunted by heat signatures. A Caldrus Ravager. Dan had heard other contestants talking about them through the translation network before those contestants went silent. Trill, get behind the fire. Stay low. You cannot fight that creature with a wooden spear. I am not going to fight it, Dan said calmly. I am going to outsmart it. The Ravager circled the camp, wary of the fire but hungry enough to challenge it. Dan did not run. Running would trigger chase instincts. Instead, he stood his ground, making himself appear larger by raising the spear overhead. The Ravager charged. Dan did not freeze. He had prepared for this. 3 days of observation had taught him the Ravager's patterns. They charged in straight lines, unable to turn quickly due to their mass. They relied on armor to absorb impacts. They expected prey to run. Dan ran, but not away. He ran at an angle, toward a narrow gap between two boulders he had identified earlier. The gap was just wide enough for a human, too narrow for a Ravager. The creature followed, building speed, claws tearing up soil. Dan reached the gap with seconds to spare and dove through. The Ravager hit the boulders with a crash that shook the ground. Stunned, trying to squeeze through, completely vulnerable, Dan did not hesitate. He drove his spear into the soft tissue under the Ravager's foreleg, where armor plates met. The sharpened stone point penetrated deep. The Ravager screamed and thrashed, but the narrow gap trapped it. Dan struck again, targeting another vulnerable point his observations had identified. It took 3 more strikes before the Ravager stopped moving. Dan sat down hard, shaking with adrenaline. Trill emerged from behind the fire, clicking rapidly with amazement. You killed it. A human with average physical capabilities killed an apex predator. I did not kill it with strength, Dan said, breathing hard. I killed it with information. I spent 3 days watching these creatures. I learned their behavior, their anatomy, their weaknesses. Then I created a situation where its strengths became disadvantages. In the observation station, absolute chaos reigned. The footage was being replayed repeatedly, analyzed from every angle. The human's physical capabilities were insufficient for direct combat, one analyst reported. Bone density too low, muscle mass inadequate, reaction time average. Yet he won, the coordinator said flatly. The young Varan researcher spoke up. He won because he changed the nature of the contest. The Ravager was designed by evolution for direct confrontation. The human refused to provide one. He created a scenario where the Ravager's armor and mass became liabilities. This is tactical thinking, a military observer noted. Advanced battlefield strategy, terrain exploitation, weakness identification. He fought like a commander, not a warrior. Dan and Trill spent the next hours processing the Ravager's body. Nothing was wasted. The armored plates would make excellent shields and building materials. The claws became new tools. The sinew would make stronger cordage. The meat would feed them for days. The bones had dozens of uses. Your people do this often? Trill asked, watching Dan systematically harvest every useful component. Humans have been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years. We call it field dressing, taking a dangerous creature and transforming it into resources. It is how we survived when everything on Earth was bigger and stronger than us. Everything? Almost everything. Earth was not kind to humans. We had no armor, no claws, no venom, no natural weapons. We were slow compared to prey and weak compared to predators. We should have gone extinct. But you did not. Dan held up a piece of the Ravager's hide. No. We learned to turn their advantages into our advantages. We learned to make their teeth into our knives, their hides into our protection, their bones into our tools. We learned that everything can be transformed through knowledge and work. By midday, Dan had improved his camp dramatically. Ravager plates reinforced the walls. Ravager hide provided waterproof covering. Ravager claws became cutting tools superior to stone. The shelter was becoming a proper structure. Trill helped, using sharp hearing to identify potential weak points in the construction. The cooperation was efficient. Dan provided knowledge and planning. Trill provided sensory data and precise measurements. Through the translation network, other contestants began sending messages. Human Dan, this is Vaughn, Krellite warrior. I am suffering from cold. My armor holds temperature but generates none. I may not survive another night. Will you share your fire knowledge? Dan considered carefully. Vaughn had mocked him during the initial briefing. But that did not matter now. Vaughn, travel to my position if you can. Bring dried plant material and wood if possible. I will teach you fire. Another message arrived. This is Moss of the Florin. I am a plant-based organism. I cannot generate heat through metabolism. I am entering dormancy. Please help. Dan looked at Trill. How many can we support? Your shelter can accommodate perhaps 5 individuals. Your food supplies are sufficient for several days with the Ravager meat. Fire fuel is abundant in this region. Then we invite them all. By evening, Dan's camp had become something unprecedented in survival trials history. A human, a Velpari, a Krellite, and a plant-based Floran sat around a fire, sharing food and warmth. Vaughn, massive and armored, was crying. I was trained as a warrior. My people value strength above all else. But strength could not create heat. I was dying until you shared this fire. Dan showed Vaughn how to maintain flames, how to bank coals, how to identify good fuel. The Krellite learned quickly, motivated by survival. Moss the Floran could not speak in ways the translator easily processed, but their gratitude was clear. The warmth from the fire allowed their biological processes to continue. They would live. Why help us? Vaughn asked. We are competitors. By helping us survive, you reduce your own chances of winning. Dan stirred the fire with a stick. Where I come from, we have a saying. Rising tides lift all boats. It means when we help each other, everyone benefits. Maybe I do not win the trial, but maybe we all survive. That seems more important. Trill clicked thoughtfully. Your species evolved this philosophy? We learned it the hard way. Humans spent thousands of years competing with each other, fighting over resources, destroying each other. We nearly went extinct not from predators but from ourselves. Eventually, enough of us learned that cooperation was better than competition. Those groups survived. The others did not. The observation station was recording every word. The conversation was being broadcast across the galaxy, translated into hundreds of languages, analyzed by thousands of species. The Varen coordinator spoke slowly. We designed the survival trials to test individual biological fitness. We believe survival was about physical superiority. The young researcher nodded. But the human is showing us survival is about knowledge sharing and cooperation. His biological capabilities are average. His social capabilities are extraordinary. A message came through from the Galactic Council itself. Continue the trials. We are observing new paradigms in survival strategy. This data is invaluable. On Caldra 7, Dan was teaching Moss how plants could be cultivated near the camp, creating sustainable food sources. He was showing Vaughn how to use strength efficiently, how to conserve energy, how to think tactically. You are teaching us to think like humans, Vaughn observed. No, Dan corrected. I am teaching you to think like survivors. These methods are not uniquely human. Every species probably discovered them independently at some point. We just remembered them. Trill asked the question they were all thinking. What happens when the trials end? We return to our worlds and forget this? Dan looked at the fire, at the shelter they had built together, at the tools scattered around the camp. That is up to you. But I hope you remember. I hope you teach others. Knowledge only survives if it is shared. As the third night descended, 5 beings from 4 different worlds sat together in warmth and safety. Above them, the galaxy watched and learned. The young Varen researcher made a note in the official record. Day 3 observation. The human has not won the survival trials. He has transformed them into something else entirely. He has created the beginning of civilization from nothing but knowledge, cooperation, and fire. Recommend new classification for human survival strategy, Civilization Builder. The coordinator approved the classification. Then it asked quietly, what happens if humans bring this philosophy to the galaxy? The researcher looked at the screen where Dan was teaching Vaughn how to make cordage. Then I think the galaxy changes. Possibly for the better, possibly forever. In the camp, Dan was thinking about his grandfather's words. Son, humanity's real superpower is not that we are strong. It is that we make everything around us stronger by being there. We are the species that teaches, and that is the most dangerous and wonderful thing we can be. He tended the fire, keeping it bright against the darkness, and prepared for whatever tomorrow would bring. The stream dried up overnight. Dan noticed it first during his morning water check. The flow had reduced to a trickle, then stopped completely. He checked upstream and found the answer. A rock slide had blocked the water source. 5 beings now depended on this camp. Water was not optional. Dan gathered everyone for a meeting. We have a problem. The stream is gone. We need to find a new water source or we will all have to signal for extraction within 2 days. Moss rustled their leaves in distress. The Floran required significant water for biological processes. Vaughn crossed his massive arms. My kind can survive longer without water, but not indefinitely. Trill clicked rapidly, echolocation scanning the surrounding terrain. I can detect density variations in the ground. Underground water creates different echo patterns than solid rock. But I have never tried to find water this way. Dan looked at the Velpari with hope. You have never tried, or your people never taught you? Both. When we developed technology, we stopped needing to find water naturally. The knowledge was lost. Then we rediscover it together, Dan said. Trill, scan the area. Look for any density variations. Vaughn, if we find water underground, can you dig? The Krellite flexed his armored limbs. I can dig through stone if needed, but it will take time. We have time. What we do not have is an alternative. They spread out in search patterns. Trill used echolocation in ways their species had not attempted in thousands of years, searching for the subtle echoes that indicated water beneath rock. Dan read the terrain, looking for plants that indicated subsurface moisture, depressions where water might collect, signs that other animals frequented certain areas. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, temperature rising. Dehydration was becoming a real threat. Finally, Trill made a discovery. Here, 3 meters down. The density pattern suggests liquid. Dan examined the spot. The ground was solid rock. 3 meters was a long way to dig, but they had no choice. Vaughn, this is your moment. We need your strength. The Krellite approached the spot and began to dig. His armored limbs, useless for creating heat, were perfect for this task. He struck the ground with focused power, breaking rock, clearing debris. But even his impressive strength tired quickly. I cannot continue at this pace, Vaughn admitted after an hour. The rock is too hard. Dan had been thinking about this problem. We do not need brute force. We need leverage and technique. He selected several long wooden poles and a large flat rock. This is called a lever. You push down on the long end, and the short end lifts with multiplied force. Humans have been using levers for thousands of years to move things we are too weak to lift directly. He demonstrated, using the lever to pry up a boulder Vaughn had loosened, but could not lift. The rock moved easily. Vaughn stared. This simple tool makes me stronger. It makes your strength more efficient, Dan corrected. Now let me show you wedges. Dan created wooden wedges and showed Vaughn how to drive them into cracks in the rock. Water was poured into the cracks and the wood expanded, splitting the stone. It was slower than pure strength, but it worked without exhausting Vaughn. The observation station was recording every technique. The young Varan researcher was making detailed notes. The human is teaching mechanical advantage. Levers, wedges, fulcrums. He is transforming individual strength into collective capability. The coordinator watched Vaughn and Dan work together. The human providing knowledge, the Krellite providing power. The combination is more effective than either individual. Exactly, the researcher said. That is the human's real advantage. He does not compete with superior capabilities. He combines with them. By midday they reached water. A spring bubbled up from the excavation, cool and clean. Everyone drank gratefully. But Dan was not satisfied with just finding water. He directed the construction of a small basin to collect it, a channel to direct overflow, and a filtration system using sand and gravel. Within hours, they had transformed a hole in the ground into a reliable water source. You do not just solve problems, Trill observed. You build systems. You think beyond immediate needs. Dan was arranging stones to prevent erosion around the water source. Immediate solutions are important. But sustainable solutions are what allow civilizations to exist. My ancestors learned this lesson repeatedly. Solve the same problem once, it stays solved. Through the translation network, a new voice arrived. Human Dan, this is Crix of the Thermans. I am in the volcanic region. The trial has changed. A storm is approaching. The temperature is dropping. My biology requires heat. Without the volcanic vents, I will enter torpor. I may not survive. Dan looked at the others. How far is the volcanic region? 4 kilometers, Trill reported. Across difficult terrain. The storm will arrive in hours, Moss added, their ability to sense atmospheric pressure proving useful. Dan made a decision. Crix rejected my help before, said primitives had nothing to teach, but I am not going to let pride kill anyone. We go get Crix. We? Vaughn asked. Yes, Trill, I need your echolocation to navigate. Vaughn, I need your strength to carry Crix if they are already weak. I need my knowledge to keep us all alive. This is not a task for one individual. This is a task for a team. They prepared quickly. Dan gathered fire-making materials. knowing they might need warmth during the storm. Vaughn collected food. Trill mapped the optimal route. Moss agreed to maintain the campfire while they were gone. The journey was difficult. The terrain was rocky and steep. Halfway there, the storm hit early. Wind screamed across the landscape. Temperature dropped rapidly. Rain began, cold and heavy. Visibility reduced to almost nothing. "We should turn back," Vaughn shouted over the wind. "Crix will die," Dan shouted back. "So might we." Dan kept moving forward. "Then we die trying. That is what my people do. We do not abandon others just because it is difficult." Trill led them using echolocation when sight failed. Vaughn broke through obstacles with strength. Dan navigated using landscape memory and instinct. They found Crix curled near a dying volcanic vent. The Thurman was barely conscious, body temperature falling into dangerous levels. "You came," Crix whispered. "I said your methods were primitive." "They are primitive," Dan agreed, wrapping Crix in the Ravager hide he brought. "But primitive is not the same as ineffective. Now save your energy. We are going home." Vaughn lifted Crix easily, cradling the Thurman against his armored chest. The journey back was harder. The storm was fully engaged now, wind and rain and cold attacking from all directions. They had to stop twice, sheltering behind rock formations while Dan started small fires using methods that worked even in rain. Fire starting was not just about creating sparks. It was about understanding what burned even when wet, how to shield flames from wind, how to build heat gradually. Each time, the fire provided just enough warmth to prevent hypothermia. Then they moved on. Hours later, they stumbled back into camp. Moss had maintained the fire beautifully. The shelter was warm and dry. Crix recovered slowly by the fire, body temperature rising to safe levels. The Thurman looked at Dan with something like wonder. "You risked death for someone who insulted you." "You needed help," Dan said simply. "That is all that mattered. This is not logical. I am a competitor. Helping me reduces your survival advantage." Dan was feeding sticks to the fire, making sure everyone stayed warm. "Maybe logic is not the only thing that matters. Maybe compassion matters too. Maybe remembering we are all living beings trying to survive matters more than individual advantage." The observation station had watched the entire rescue. The footage was being broadcast across hundreds of worlds. Species that had never met humans were seeing human behavior for the first time. The Varen coordinator spoke slowly. "The human survival strategy makes no logical sense. He continuously reduces his individual advantage to help competitors." The young researcher had tears in their eyes. An unusual display for a Varen, unless survival is not his actual goal, unless he is demonstrating something more important. What could be more important than survival? Proving that survival is better when it is shared. Proving that the strongest survival strategy is cooperation. He is not trying to win the trial. He is trying to change what winning means. That night, 6 beings from 5 different worlds sat around one fire. The storm raged outside, but inside they were safe. Dan told stories of Earth, about how humans almost destroyed themselves, about how they learned, slowly and painfully, that working together was the only path forward, about how the knowledge of survival, passed from generation to generation, became humanity's greatest treasure. Crix listened carefully. "My people forgot these lessons. We became so specialized to heat that we forgot how to survive cold. We thought specialization was strength." "Specialization is strength," Dan said, "in the right environment. But environments change. Adaptation is the ultimate survival trait, and the best adaptation is the ability to learn and change." Vaughn asked a question that had been building. "Human Dan, what happens when we return to our worlds? When we go back to our specialized lives?" Dan looked around at the faces, human and alien, all illuminated by firelight. "You remember this. You teach others. You show your people that the old knowledge, the primitive knowledge, is not outdated. It is foundational. Everything else is built on top of it." Trill clicked softly. "We remember you, the human who taught the galaxy to survive." "No," Dan corrected gently. "Remember yourselves. You are the ones who chose to learn. You are the ones who chose cooperation over isolation. You are the ones who proved different species can work together. I just showed you it was possible." The storm continued through the night, but it did not matter. They had fire, shelter, food, water, and each other. The galaxy watched and learned. The extraction shuttles arrived on the 7th day. Dan and his group sat around the fire, watching the ships land across the canyon. Emergency protocols had finally cleared. The trial was officially over. Through the translation network, the Varan coordinator's voice echoed. All contestants prepare for extraction. Medical teams are standing by. The survival trials are concluded. Dan looked at his companions. Trill, who had learned to maintain fire and hunt cooperatively. Vaughn, who had learned that strength was more effective when guided by knowledge. Moss, who had taught them all patience and how to cultivate sustainable food sources. Crix, who had learned that specialization without adaptation was fragility. And 2 others who had joined in the last days, a pair of quick-moving aliens called Quillen, who had brought speed and agility to the group's collective capabilities. "We should go," Trill said quietly. "The trial is over." But none of them moved. Vaughn spoke what they were all thinking. "This feels wrong. We are not finished." "The rules say 7 days or until all contestants extract," Dan reminded them. "We followed the rules." "The rules measured individual survival," Crick said, the Thurman's voice thoughtful. "But we did not survive individually. We survived as something else." "As a community," Moss added, their rustling leaves carrying weight, "as a civilization in miniature." Dan stood and looked at the camp they had built. The shelter with its walls of stone and Ravager plate, the fire pit with carefully arranged rocks for heat management, the water collection system, the food storage area, the tool-making station where stone and bone had been transformed into useful implements. In 7 days, they had created something that looked less like a survival camp and more like a permanent settlement. "When we leave," Dan said slowly, "all of this stays. The fire will die. The shelter will empty. Everything we built together will be abandoned." "That is the nature of trials," the coordinator's voice came through the network. "You were testing survival capability." "The test is complete. Please proceed to extraction points." Dan picked up a piece of flint, one of dozens they had shaped. "I want to show you something before we go." He gathered the group and began creating a final tool. Not for survival, but for legacy. He used the best stoneworking techniques he knew, creating a hand axe with careful, deliberate strikes. The blade was sharp and balanced. The handle was wrapped in cordage. The entire piece was functional and beautiful. "This is a tool," Dan said, holding it up. "But it is also a message. Whoever finds this, maybe years from now, will know that intelligent beings were here. They will know we had knowledge. They will know we cooperated. This tool tells a story." He placed the axe carefully in the center of the camp, surrounded by a circle of stones. Then he added other items, a woven basket, a fire-starting kit, samples of cordage in different styles, a collection of shaped stones. "This is called a cache," Dan explained. "My ancestors did this. They left knowledge for those who came after. Skills stored in objects. Future people could find this and learn." The group understood. They each added something to the cache. Trill contributed a map they had created using echolocation data, carved into a flat stone. Vaughn left a lever and fulcrum system, demonstrating mechanical advantage. Moss planted seeds of the food plants they had cultivated. Crix created a solar reflector from Ravager plates showing how to concentrate heat. The cache grew into a comprehensive survival kit. But more than that, it became a library of techniques. Everything they had learned preserved for the future. The observation station was silent, watching this unprecedented action. The young Varan researcher finally spoke. "They are not just leaving. They are teaching. They are passing knowledge to beings who do not exist yet." The coordinator's voice was different now, less clinical, more emotional. "Why the trial is over. They gain nothing from this effort. They gain the knowledge that what they learned will not be lost," the researcher said. "The human is thinking in terms of legacy, not just personal survival, but species survival, knowledge survival." The extraction teams were waiting, but no one rushed the group. Something important was happening. Dan made one final addition to the cache. He took a flat stone and, using a sharp flake, carved symbols. Not words exactly, but pictographs. A human figure with a fire. Multiple species sitting together. Tools being made. Water being found. The storm being survived. "This is our story," he said. "So whoever comes next knows it is possible." Finally, they walked to the extraction shuttles. Medical teams scanned them immediately. The results were surprising. "All individuals show signs of stress and exertion," the medical officer reported. "But no critical injuries, no severe malnutrition, no diseases. These are some of the healthiest trial survivors we have processed." Back at Horizon's Edge Station, the group underwent formal debriefing. Each contestant was interviewed separately, then together. The Varen coordinator led the session personally. Dan Carter, human representative. You did not win the survival trials by any traditional metric. You were not the last individual surviving. You did not demonstrate superior physical capabilities. Yet your impact on the trials was unprecedented. Explain. Dan thought about the question. I did not try to win. I tried to survive. And I learned a long time ago that humans survive best when we are not alone. You helped competitors. You shared resources. You taught skills that reduced your advantages. I shared knowledge, Dan corrected. Knowledge is not reduced by sharing. It is multiplied. The coordinator consulted data displays. Your actions have created complications. The survival trials are meant to identify individual biological fitness. You transformed them into a test of social cooperation. This was not the intended purpose. Maybe the intended purpose was wrong, Dan said quietly. Silence filled the room. No contestant had ever challenged the fundamental premise of the trials. Dan continued. You tested which species could survive alone. But survival is not a solo activity. No successful species survives alone. We survive as groups, as communities, as civilizations. Testing individuals tells you which biology is strongest. Testing cooperation tells you which species will thrive. Vaughn spoke up, supporting Dan. I am physically stronger than the human. My armor is superior, yet I would have died without his knowledge. Individual strength is not the same as survival capability. Trill added, my sensory capabilities exceed the humans, but I could not create fire or tools. The human's knowledge made my abilities useful. Alone, I was weak. Together, we were strong. The coordinator looked at each contestant, then at the data. You are all recommending a fundamental change to the survival trials? Yes, they said in unison. This is unprecedented. Dan leaned forward. Good. Unprecedented means you are learning something new. That is the whole point, is it not? To learn what makes species survive. The Varen coordinator made a decision. This session is concluded. Your recommendations will be forwarded to the Galactic Council. Dan Carter, you are asked to remain on station. The Council wishes to speak with you directly. Hours later, Dan stood before a holographic assembly of representatives from dozens of worlds. The Galactic Council rarely convened for individual matters, but the survival trials had become something much larger than a simple competition. The council speaker, an ancient being whose species Dan could not identify, addressed him. Human Dan Carter, we have observed your actions on Caldra 7. We have reviewed your methods. We have analyzed your impact. You have caused significant discussion across the galaxy. I apologize if I caused problems, Dan said. You did not cause problems. You caused questions. Important questions. For thousands of years, we have measured civilization by technological advancement. We have measured survival by individual capability. You have shown us a different measurement. Dan waited, uncertain what was coming. You have shown us that knowledge shared freely is more powerful than any tool. That cooperation between species is not just possible but beneficial. That survival is not about being strongest but about being adaptable. The speaker paused, and Dan could sense the weight of many worlds watching. The Galactic Council extends an offer to humanity. Join us not as applicants, but as teachers. Establish a survival institute, sharing your species' knowledge of adaptation and cooperation. Help us remember what our civilizations forgot when we reached for the stars. Dan felt the enormity of the offer. You want humans to teach the galaxy? We want you to teach us to survive. We have technology. We have power. But you have something we lost. You have the knowledge of how to build civilization from nothing. How to work together despite differences, how to turn adversity into strength. Dan thought about his grandfather, about the camping trips, about the stories of human history, about all the times humans nearly destroyed themselves and somehow, barely chose cooperation over destruction. I accept, he said, but with one condition. Name it. I'm not the only teacher. Trill, Vaughn, Moss, Crix, and the others, they teach too. Because the lesson is not that humans are special. The lesson is that anyone can learn these skills. Anyone can choose cooperation. Anyone can remember what their ancestors knew. The speaker made a sound that the translator interpreted as approval. Agreed. You will establish the institute together. A multi-species faculty teaching multi-species students. As Dan left the council chamber, the young Varen researcher was waiting. You did it. You changed everything. I just showed them what was possible, Dan said. They chose to see it. What now? Dan smiled. Now we teach. We show every species in the galaxy how to make fire, how to find water, how to build shelter, how to work together. We show them that primitive is not the same as simple, and that the oldest knowledge is often the most important. Because those who forget how to survive eventually stop surviving, the researcher said, understanding. Exactly. They walked together toward the observation deck where they could see dozens of worlds through the massive windows. Each world represented a species, a history, a unique path to the stars. It is going to take a long time, the researcher observed. Yes, Dan agreed. But humans are patient when we need to be. We spent thousands of years learning these lessons. We can spend a few more teaching them. He thought about the cache they left on Caldris 7, the tools and knowledge preserved for future finders. He thought about his grandfather's voice teaching him to start fire. He thought about the long chain of human knowledge, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation across millennia. And now that chain would extend across species, across worlds, across the galaxy, all because someone remembered that survival is a skill, not just a trait, and skills can be taught. 5 years had passed since Caldris 7. The Survival Institute now occupied an entire sector of Horizon's Edge Station, with satellite facilities on 17 different worlds. Dan Carter stood in the main training facility, watching 50 beings from 30 species attempt to create fire using friction methods. Most were failing, perfectly. Good, Dan called out. Failure is part of learning. Try again. Remember, speed is important, but so is pressure. Find the balance. A young Krellite, similar species to Vaughn but next generation, struck their fireboard too hard and cracked it. The alien looked embarrassed. Dan walked over calmly. What did you learn? He asked. That I am too strong for this task? No. You learned the limits of your material. Now you know to choose harder wood or apply less force. That is not failure. That is data. The Krellite tried again, this time with controlled strength. Smoke appeared, then a coal, then flame. The alien's triumph was visible even across species differences. Trill supervised navigation training in another section. The Velpari had become an expert teacher, showing species how to use their natural abilities in new ways. A group of sound-sensitive aliens was learning echolocation techniques, while others learned to read terrain and weather patterns. Vaughn ran the tools and engineering section. The massive Krellite demonstrated how simple machines worked. Levers, pulleys, wedges, inclined planes. He showed species how to multiply their natural strength through mechanical advantage, rather than brute force. Moss had established agricultural programs teaching sustainable food production. The Florin's patient, methodical approach was perfect for helping species understand long-term resource management. Crix, who had once mocked primitive methods, now taught thermal management and adaptation to varying climates. The Therman had learned the lesson well. Specialization was valuable, but flexibility was essential. Dan moved through the facility, observing, assisting, teaching. He stopped at a station where a debate was happening. These primitive methods are inefficient, a technology-focused species was arguing. We have portable fusion reactors. Why learn to make fire with sticks? Dan had heard this argument many times. Valid question. Why learn the old ways when we have advanced technology? He picked up a piece of flint and a striker. Here is my answer. Technology is wonderful. It extends our capabilities. But technology depends on infrastructure, on supply chains, on maintenance. What happens when that infrastructure fails? We repair it, the alien said confidently. With what? Using knowledge of what? If you have never created energy from basic materials, how do you recreate your technology from scratch? Dan struck the flint, creating sparks. This is not primitive because it is old. This is fundamental because it works with or without infrastructure. This is the baseline. Everything else is built on top of this foundation. He let the sparks fall onto prepared tinder. Learn this and you understand the principles. Understand the principles and you can rebuild anything. A message interrupted the session. Dan was needed in the council chamber. Urgent. The Galactic Council had assembled again, and this time the mood was different. Tense. Worried. The speaker addressed Dan immediately. We have a crisis. The colony world of Halcyon 3 has suffered catastrophic infrastructure failure. An electromagnetic pulse from a solar flare destroyed all electronic systems. 30,000 colonists are stranded. No power, no communications, no technology. Dan felt his heart rate increase. How long until rescue? 3 months minimum. The pulse created a debris field that makes approach dangerous. By the time we can safely send aid, many colonists may have died from exposure, starvation, or dehydration. Can you communicate with them at all? Limited. We dropped communication drones at safe distance. The colonists are panicking. Most species in the colony are technology dependent. Without their systems, they do not know how to survive. Dan understood immediately why they had called him. You want me to teach them remotely? Through the drones. More than that. We want you to go. We have one ship capable of making the journey with shielding sufficient to survive the debris field, but it can only carry a small team. You and perhaps 3 others. Dan did not hesitate. I will go, and I know exactly who I need with me. Within hours, Dan had assembled his team. Trill for reconnaissance and navigation, Vaughn for strength and construction, Moss for food and agriculture. They were the original group from Caldris 7. The ones who learned together, survived together. The journey to Halcyon 3 took 6 days. They used the time to prepare, reviewing everything they knew about the colony's environment, the species present, the resources available. 30,000 beings, Vaughn said, looking at the data. We cannot teach them all individually. We do not need to, Dan replied. We teach teachers. Find the individuals who can learn quickly, who can communicate well. They teach others. Knowledge spreads exponentially if you structure it correctly. When they arrived at Halcyon 3, the situation was worse than reported. The colony was in chaos. Species that had never experienced true hardship were suffering. Some had already died. Others were on the edge of giving up. Dan and his team landed at the colony's central hub. The buildings were intact but lifeless without power. Colonists gathered, desperate, frightened. Dan stood on a platform where everyone could see him. He did not have translation technology anymore, that was fried too. But the communication drone provided basic translation. My name is Dan Carter. I am human. These are my colleagues, Trill, Vaughn, and Moss. We are here to teach you how to survive. A colonist shouted, We need rescue, not teaching. Rescue is coming, Dan said calmly. In 3 months. We are here to make sure you live long enough to be rescued. And we start now. He had Vaughn place a pile of materials on the ground. Wood, dry grass, stones, plant fibers. Basic materials available anywhere on the colony. This is everything you need to survive. Watch carefully. Dan created fire using a bow drill. The colonists watched in stunned silence as flames appeared from friction and wood. Fire provides heat, cooks food, purifies water, and creates light. Fire is the first technology. I am going to teach 50 of you how to make fire. Those 50 will each teach 10 more. By tomorrow, 500 colonists can create fire. By the end of the week, everyone will know. He moved to the next demonstration. Water, you need clean water. Without technology, you purify using heat or filtration. He showed the stone boiling method. He showed sand filtration. He showed how to identify water sources by reading the landscape. Food, some of you can synthesize nutrients, but your synthesizers are dead. You need real food now. Moss took over, showing which local plants were safe to eat, how to identify them, how to prepare them. Vaughn demonstrated trap construction for catching local animals. For hours, they taught the fundamentals: fire, water, food, shelter, the absolute basics of survival. The colonists who watched carefully, who asked questions, who practiced immediately, those were the ones Dan identified as teachers. He pulled them aside. You 50, you are now instructors. Your job is to spread this knowledge. Take 10 students each. Teach them everything I showed you. Tomorrow your students become teachers too. One of the new instructors, a species Dan did not recognize, asked nervously, What if I teach it wrong? Then you learn from the mistake and teach it correctly next time. Knowledge is refined through practice. Do not be afraid of being imperfect. Be afraid of not trying. The first night fires appeared across the colony. Small flames at first, then larger ones as confidence grew. The psychological impact was immediate. Light and warmth drove back fear. Dan and his team moved through the colony, identifying additional needs: medical care without technology, waste management without plumbing, communication without electronics. For every problem, they found a solution rooted in fundamental principles. By the second week, the colony had transformed. Organized teams managed water purification. Food gathering and preparation was systematic. Shelter improvements were ongoing. A basic government structure had emerged to coordinate efforts. Dan taught leadership principles too. Survival is not just physical. It is social. Organize yourselves. Assign responsibilities. Work together. A council formed with representatives from different species. They met daily around a fire, the most primitive technology becoming the center of their rebuilt civilization. Trill taught scouting and mapping. Teams explored the surrounding area, finding new resources, identifying hazards, creating knowledge of their environment. Von taught engineering. Simple machines appeared throughout the colony. Water wheels for moving water uphill, pulleys for construction, levers for moving heavy objects. Mechanical advantage replaced electrical power. Moss taught sustainable agriculture. Gardens appeared using local plants and earth techniques. Food production became reliable. But the most important teaching was philosophical. Dan gathered the colony leadership one evening. 3 months ago you had technology and took it for granted. Then it was taken away and you thought you would die. But you are not dying. You are thriving. What changed? A colony leader, a wise elder from a long-lived species, answered. We changed. We learned that survival is not about having the best tools. It is about knowing how to create tools from anything. Exactly, Dan said. Technology is wonderful, but it should enhance your capabilities, not replace them. When you rebuild your infrastructure, and you will, remember these weeks. Remember that you survived. Remember how you survived. 2 months into the crisis, the colony was not just surviving but developing culture. Art appeared, created from natural materials. Music was made with primitive instruments. Stories were shared around fires. Different species who had lived separately in technological bubbles now mixed freely, united by shared struggle and shared triumph. When the rescue ships finally arrived, they found something unexpected. The colonists were healthy, organized, and reluctant to leave. We can restore your infrastructure, the rescue coordinator offered. Return everything to normal. Please do restore the infrastructure, the colony leader said. But nothing will return to normal. Normal was taking survival for granted. Normal was forgetting the fundamentals. We do not want that normal back. Dan stood with his team watching the rescue operations. They had succeeded beyond expectation. Trill clicked softly. We should feel proud. We should feel grateful, Dan corrected. We were given the chance to teach. That is always a gift. Vaughn asked the question that was on everyone's mind.
What now?
Dan looked at the colony, at the fires still burning even with power being restored. Now we train more teachers, because Halcyon 3 will not be the last crisis. Systems fail, technology breaks, but knowledge, properly taught and maintained, survives everything. They returned to Horizon's Edge and the Survival Institute. News of Halcyon 3 had spread across the galaxy. Applications to the Institute increased 1,000-fold. Species that had dismissed primitive methods now begged to learn them. Dan stood in front of a new class of 500 students. The largest ever. They represented 100 species from across known space. Welcome to the Survival Institute, he began. You are here to learn what your ancestors knew. How to create fire, how to find water, how to build shelter, how to work together. He held up a piece of flint. This is a rock, just a rock. But with knowledge, it becomes a tool. With practice, it becomes a skill. With sharing, it becomes civilization. He struck the flint, creating sparks that fell onto waiting tinder. You will learn to do this. Then you will teach others. Then they will teach others. Knowledge freely shared never dies. It only grows when the tinder caught fire. Flames spread bright and warm. This is how we survive. Not by being the strongest or the smartest or the most specialized, but by remembering that everything we need is already around us. We just need to know how to see it. Years later, when Dan was old and thinking about retirement, he received a message from Caldris 7. A research team had found the cache he and his friends had left. The tools were still there, preserved by the dry climate. The carved stone told their story. But more importantly, the cache had been added to. Other survival teams, other students had visited and left their own contributions. New tools, new techniques, new knowledge. The cache was growing, becoming a permanent library of survival wisdom. Dan smiled, reading the report. The young Varan researcher, now old like Dan, sat beside him. Your legacy, the Varan said. Our legacy, Dan corrected. All of us who chose to remember. All of us who chose to teach. They said no tools allowed, the Varan recalled. But you brought the most powerful tool of all. Not a tool, Dan said, watching new students through the window as they learned to make fire. Knowledge. The ability to see tools in everything. The willingness to share what we know. That is not a tool. That is what makes us civilized. The fire outside caught. A new student succeeded for the first time. Their joy was visible across species barriers. Dan stood slowly, his body aged, but his mind still sharp. I should go help. They will have questions. You have been teaching for decades. Do you never tire? Dan walked toward the door, toward the students, toward the future. How can I tire of teaching survival? Every person who learns is another person who can teach others. Every species that remembers is another species that will survive. This is not work. This is hope. He stepped outside, and a dozen species turned to him with questions. How do you maintain fire and wind? What plants make the best cordage? How do you read weather patterns? Dan answered each question patiently, showing not just what to do but why it works, teaching not just skills but understanding. Above them, visible through the station windows, 1,000 worlds turned in the darkness. On many of those worlds, beings who had forgotten now remembered. Species who had relied on technology now understood fundamentals. Civilizations that had been fragile were becoming resilient. All because one human, when told no tools allowed, had understood that knowledge was not a tool. It was the foundation everything else was built upon. And foundations, properly maintained and shared, could last forever. The fire burned bright. The students learned. The galaxy, slowly but surely, remembered what it meant to survive. And in remembering, it became stronger than it had ever been before.